Hello, welcome to the Crackpot
Won't you lend your lungs to me?
Podcast.
Mine are collapsing. Plant my feet and bitterly breathe up the time that's passed. Breath I'll take and breath I'll give. Pray the day's not poised. Stand among the ones that live in lonely indecision.
Hello, welcome to episode 47 of the Crackpot Podcast. We have a special guest today, Nick Mason from The Myth of the 20th Century. We're going to talk about Robert E. Howard, specifically his Solomon Kane character. So welcome, Nick.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for coming on, Nick. First, I remember talking to Nick after recording one time on Myth of the 20th Century. And Nick, you were speaking about setting up a podcast for literary discussion?
Yes, I have not released it yet, but it is in the works.
Okay. Well, I'll be looking forward to that.
Yeah, is that going to be a regular thing?
It won't be a weekly thing, but it'll be fairly regular. It'll just be when I can get around to it, basically, because I have so many other projects. We just started a website too, for articles and things like that. It's called theamericansun.com. There's not much up there right now, but we're taking submissions. So if you have anybody who has good content, you can send them our way.
Is that the Myth of the 20th Century, guys?
Well, yeah, it's some other people too, but yeah, it's us.
Is the site up?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, if you could send me a link, I'll put a link to it on my main site.
Will do.
Well, we were just talking about how we came to this idea of doing a Howard podcast. Actually, James and I had talked about it before, but it was Alex Nicholson who was interested in joining as well. So, Alex Nicholson, wherever you are, this one's for you.
I could speak a little bit, I think, for Alex's interest in it. I'm sure he enjoyed his fiction, but Alex was, of course, very interested in ancient population movements and that kind of thing. And Howard, obviously, his fiction is very thinly veiled historiography. When it comes to the character names and races and places, they're all taken from the history books.
That's right. It's been pointed out by, for example, Greg Cochran, that you can get a better idea of a lot of ancient history by reading Howard than you can from reading modern anthropology literature.
Yes, exactly.
With this character, when you read the unpublished fragments and all, Howard did a whole lot of reading on British history in the 16th and 17th century. And it wasn't just whatever he was reading. I don't know what books he read, but it wasn't what got into the standard history books that you would see now. And he had, for instance, he had a knowledge of the skullduggery of Francis Drake, what Drake did to screw other sea captains out of their contracts that they had, their charters that they had through the monarchy, and even their ability to gain fame fighting the great enemy of Great Britain, which was Spain at the time. I mean, this whole country was united around the idea that they weren't going to let their queen get raped by this Spanish dog who was willing to send the most savage field marshal of the age into England just to get the bride that he wanted. And so you had this whole country united in the cause of keeping Queen Elizabeth a virgin. She was married to the country. She wasn't going to be married to the Spanish guy. And there were some of the best things sea captains were not even permitted to take part in this war. And Howard actually weaves that into the Solomon Kane character all the way down to his motivation, and had a very low opinion of Francis Drake. That shows through in a couple of his pieces. So I thought that was fascinating. That was information I didn't come across until I was in my 50s.
So you guys cut out there for a second for me.
Sorry about that. Well, James was talking about the history between England and Spain in terms of the seafaring and the rivalry, and as well as Sir Francis Drake, who was kind of a scoundrel.
Yeah, the Sea Dogs, they called them. And so the first one's Hawkins. Drake, after the Battle of Veracruz, Drake supplants Hawkins, and Hawkins fades into obscurity. And it was really a matter of luck. It wasn't Hawkins' fault. He didn't really screw up. They were outgunned by the Spanish. And Drake just had the one ship that didn't get hauled. So that was the first of the Sea Dogs. He basically gets rid of him. Sir Walter Raleigh gets his head chopped off because of these guys. He had the deed to Virginia, and that Roanoke colony was intentionally marooned by a pirate in the employ of Drake's masters so that Riley would lose this contract and the Virginia Company could be formed around the contract taken up to supplant it. And then there was the greatest hero of the age, Sir Richard Grenville, which shows up in, I think, 3 Solomon Kane stories, none of which were sold. And Howard was very interested in the history of these sea dogs, and the Kane character, in a way, is personified wrath as a rejection of the behavior of these British sea dogs.
I do remember the Kane story. The name escapes me, but Kane encounters some lad who's he's in a duel or something, and it turns out that his sweetheart was kidnapped by this black ship off the
Flame of Vengeance.
Yes.
Yeah. It didn't sell in his life.
Oh, it didn't sell.
No, that was a good story.
So, James, tell us the book that you're working from, because this is an interesting book that includes everything related to the character, even including fragments and previously untold stories. So what's the name and the edition there?
The title is The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane by Ballantine Books under the Del Rey imprint. And I had read different Kane paperbacks named after different major novellas in the series, before. There used to be a paperback titled Skulls and the Stars, which was the title of the first Kane story, which was a short story that was sold. And then there was a title, I think, the Moon of Skulls, that was the real big, it's really a short novel or a novella that he did about Kane going all the way to Africa to rescue this English girl who had been sold to the Turks. She was the daughter of an English lord who another English lord sold to the Turks, and she ended up being sold to some African queen who Kane goes and confronts. So there's 3 different points where the whole white slavery thing pops up in Howard's reading of what was going on in the British Isles. And then there's 3 points where the thing with the sea dogs pop up. The story that Nick was talking about, the Blue Flame of Vengeance, there was no supernatural element and there was no exotic locale. In other words, it was a very good and typical Kane story. It's not a novelette, but it doesn't seem like he sold, after the first story sold that was set in England, it seems he did not realize another sale of this character unless it was set in an exotic location and or had a supernatural element. But each one of these books in this Del Rey collection, there's one for Call, there's one for Bran McMorn, one for El Borak, who are other heroes of Howard's, and then there's 3 for the Conan character. They have the stories written in the order that they appear to have been written, and it includes unpublished fragments and unsold stories. And this can get pretty extensive. Howard had more stuff unsold than sold as far as these volumes are concerned. It's like a 60-40. It was almost a 50-50 split.
When you follow the stories in the order that they were written, do you notice a sort of a decline in the racial animus of the character?
Only in that in the final stories, this has become a Puritan Tarzan. Okay, and it was partially because of the setting. I think that he really had most of the success selling stories set in Africa, and I think it had to do with the location. Interestingly, the character becomes more and more the inheritor of the white man's burden. It's like he's this Protestant character that's in Tarzan's position, and Howard's experimenting with different storylines that aren't far off of Edgar Rice Burroughs storylines with the Tarzan character, but trying not to duplicate elements of it.
I really like the interplay between the African drums and the African darkness and the ancient, all kinds of ancient, whether it's animals or, demons that they chased into Africa, and his Puritanism, because I thought Howard did a really good job kind of keeping them lined up. He never, I don't think Howard's sympathies would be with the Puritanism, but he kept the treatment of it, I thought, really even-handed as to how this guy would handle seeing all these weird things.
Right.
How would you contrast the Kane character with Conan in this way? Because he's definitely a product of civilized man.
Right. Oh, well, first of all, the Conan character is more of it's like he's more of a jack of all trades, and Kane is more limited. For instance, Kane's got no facility with any language other than his own. He just speaks English and that's it. With the Conan character, you get the idea that this was a guy that grew up almost as an orphan in camps of mercenaries and could speak all these different languages with various amounts of poor usage, always with a barbaric accent. And his relationship with Africa, for instance, there's a lot of Conan stories set in Africa. And he even uses historical names for places of Africa, and you could pick out where they would have been in modern Africa when you look at the map of his world. And Conan's a guy that he'll have no problem snapping up black girlfriends. He's as comfortable having like black warriors fighting for him as white guys. Kane's more of like a daddy figure, and it seems to be hooked up with, there's two different, his African experience gets split two ways. There's the story Red Shadows, where he finds this girl that's been raped by this French brigand, and he decides he decides to avenge her death, and it's probably the best story of the whole cycle. And he ends up making an alliance with the witch doctor when he finally finds out where this man has gone. And when he goes back to Africa later, which, looking at the way the stories were written, I think it was the writing market that forced him to take the character back to Africa. It's the way it looks. And when he does that, for the first two stories in that cycle, the witch doctor really struggles as the lead character here. The witch doctor is actually the more interesting character in those two stories. Right? And one of them is The Hills of the Dead. And you find out at the end of African stories that the witch doctor has given him King Solomon's staff. And he's got this horrible animus against the Arabs. Basically, this is very similar to the Tarzan character of Edgar Rice Burroughs, where what the black Africans were for the Kane character was really a population that he could represent against a real racial enemy, which was the Arabs and the people of Islam. So that's Footfalls Within is really stark with his demonstration of that, his hatred of the materialistic Arab.
And that one really, the star of that story is really the staff, the juju stick they call it, or King Solomon's staff, which it's kind of the pivot point for Howard to describe this long sweeping arc of the spiritual interaction with the material, and how Solomon Kane is just, one guy in a long line of these people that fight on behalf of good, and he's like this dour Puritan. He's English. He's from England, and he's tall and white and skinny and stuff, and it's just a big contrast, but it really works.
What was your favorite story of his, Nick, on the Kane character? So I think you read all Howard's stuff.
That would be the one you mentioned earlier, where he's trying to track down the woman from the girl from the African Queen.
The Moon of Skulls.
Yes, I believe that's what it's called. Yeah, I do mix up that with the girl who gets raped. Yeah, as far as the relationship, because I remember in one of those stories, Kane had some kind of past friendship or familial tie to this girl. He had some debt to the family. I forget which.
Yes.
Which one was that?
The story of the Moon of Skulls. He had promised the father of this kidnapped girl that he would recover her or avenge her. That was Moon of Skulls. Red Shadows. It was a nameless French peasant girl that had been raped that he was avenging, and he's willing to chase this guy all the way around the planet to avenge this girl. So probably Red Shadows for me is the story where it shows the prime element of Kane at his strongest, which is really wrath. He really, to me, personifies wrath by far more than any of the Howard characters. And in the Moon of Skulls, I guess Serena Williams as an African queen is this highly athletic and highly athletic queen. All these really, and the way that the black warriors under her described they have very clean lines. They're very healthy. They're very loyal. They're not idiots, and they're very masculine. Howard doesn't represent them as in any way a degenerate race or anything, which he'll do in a lot of his stories, his lost race stories. He has these degenerate races, but the offer that she makes him, she pleads with Kane to be her king, and they'll go out from Africa and they'll even like rape and pillage Europe and everything and pay back his enemies. And of course, Kane's horrified. The Conan character.
Yeah, he would have taken her up on that.
Right.
Yeah, he would have been, yeah, go baby, let's do this. That sounds like a great idea. Yeah, Conan would have been all about that. You know? That would have even.
Yeah.
But Kane was scandalized.
There's also a subtext there of racial envy on the part of the queen.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
She wanted a white. I mean, she was always asking her guards, like, "What'd you do with that guy? Where is he? Why'd you lose him?" You know, she knew he was.
Well, and in the story, he meets. I think it's a ghost. It might be a person. It might be a ghost. But he somehow becomes apprised of the story of this city.
The priest.
Right. In a lot of lost cities, that, for instance, in the Conan stories, it's never the people that live in the city that built it. The people that Conan or Kane runs into, there are some people that moved in. We're all familiar with that process now. That seemed odd to me when I was reading this in the 70s. But now, after living in Baltimore, I understand what Howard was getting at and have experienced it myself. But there's this older Atlantean, like mixed race that actually built this place. So part of it is, this woman being the nobility of these black people, reaching back for the idea that half of her ancestors weren't black. And she wants a man to bring that out in her, hopefully in a child that's going to come out halfway in between. But that seduction on Kane, for instance, the H. Rider Haggard story, I don't know if either of you saw the film adaptation of that.
Of Kane?
No, it's a guy named H. Rider Haggard wrote 3 stories set in Africa, and one of them was titled She. No. And the movie starred Ursula Andress, and she's a Caucasian African queen in this lost city. Guys in America and Europe are writing a lot of these lost city stories where you find, like Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar, where you find this lost city in the middle of Africa, and there's a couple of the scoins of this ancient white race that are ruling over the savages or something like that. And the explorer, he is offered the hand of the queen to try to infuse fresh blood into the line. And it's a type of literature that's really reviled by liberal people today. But
they only read Harry Potter.
Right. Kane does not go for that. We're talking about how Conan would have gone for that offer, be my king. In the story, the guy goes for it. And then part of the ceremony is when they get together and they marry each other, they have to stand under the moonbeam that shines in through like this skull that the top of the mountain's carved out of. And then Ursula Andress, and this was made like in the late 50s she was like a James Bond girl, right? Mm-hmm. She starts becoming old until she's eventually like a pile of wrinkled rags crawling towards his feet, and he's recoiling in horror. And now he's stuck with this curse of immortality down in this city, and he never does consummate the marriage with her, which was just him inheriting the burden of this immortal status ruling over these savage people.
It's a trap.
These stories that were being written 20, 30 years before Howard wrote his Kane stuff, these guys would generally always go for the trap, like the man who would be king. He wrote a story that was a fragment, The Hawk of Basti, which is in this book, which is very much like Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King, but set in Africa with him and another sea captain. But Kane is a character that's atypical. He's not an explorer adventurer. He's just an avenger and a purifier, so he doesn't go for these things.
To me, Conan, the one word for Conan in my mind is impulsive. He, like Kane, as you say, he's kind of this purified an instrument of vengeance. But Conan he's just hanging out. He goes here, he goes there. He's looking for adventure. He's looking for pretty girls. And if there's something fun to do, he'll do it. Where Conan is like looking for work. He needs to get stuff done.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Conan's a cool character. He's like you took Big Ron and Tony Cox, okay, and rip off their clothes and give them a sword, and just that's all they can do, whatever they want. It's really cool. And apparently, Howard based this character on a lot of working guys working rough jobs on oil rigs and stuff in West Texas. That he based his character on actual working guys like that, roughnecks.
I think that, to Lynn's point, you can see Conan most out of his element when he's having to live as a king in various stories.
Yes, and I very much like that. I mean, that's the prototype for Conan was the Call character, and he's this alienated barbarian usurper of this imperial throne, and you could clearly see where the Conan character is really a much more saleable version of Call. Call was like this brooding guy. Physically, they were the same, and their position as a barbarian king in a civilized area was the same thing. Howard had learned how to work saleable elements into his characters, writing these adventures. So at the end of his career, he's even writing action heroes in stories where there's no horrific element, and they're working. Kane's interesting to me because he's almost like the straight-jacketed version of the other characters. Even this character, who is you would think he's somebody out of the Scarlet Letter, but there's a couple lines in two different stories where the narrator describes Kane as somebody who has never examined himself.
He's almost inhuman.
That was my final analysis there were two stories where Howard describes Kane as somebody who does not look within. He does not question his convictions. He doesn't even question his passion or his impulses when he gets it. And to the extent that he shows passion, it's just to follow his archetype, which is wrath. At the end, there's a poem that he didn't sell, and you could tell he wrote this poem to finish the character off in his mind. And it seems like Howard used poems that he wrote for himself about his characters as kind of like an inspiration, not expecting to sell them, because I don't think he sold many of them. And it's called The Homecoming of Solomon Kane. And I think it's the next to the last, Lynn says they're called stanzas, I call them verses, right? the next to the last glop of rhyming text, okay, in couplets, Kane actually reflects about himself in regard to a question that he was asked, and he can't look at his own reflection within himself, and he gets up and leaves. So he had come from wherever, adventuring around the world, to come home, and as somebody asked him a question about himself, he couldn't handle the answer, and he got up and he left. And that's the end. The last stanza is just the point of view of the people in the town seeing this enigmatic guy go away into the shadows.
How do you contrast Howard's views on civilization between the two characters?
I actually don't think that they're incongruent. Kane is necessary because civilization is such a festering pit of nastiness that in which the evil men, the one thing that you'll find is, relatively speaking, and as far as the character's prowess, his masculine prowess, Kane's no more of an alpha male than any other sea captain. He's considered second in his physical ability to face other sea captains to guys like Grenville, Drake, and Hawke. There are three characters that are depicted. Kane's not like the dominant male among alpha males that Conan is, okay? So Conan's the guy that would walk into a room of alpha males and make them all bitches, okay? Kane's not that guy. Kane actually has a very hard time dispatching the two pirate captains that he duels with in order to avenge some wrongs that they have done. So Kane's a character that's given no more prowess than the evil men that are stalking civilization. So he's, in a way, he's the antithesis of the superhero. It's weird that this character was written right when the abomination of the superhero was invented in the same country, or different parts of the country. But Howard's hero, Kane, doesn't have any superpowers or anything. The only thing he has is his wrath, and he's not physically superior like other heroes of the age, or other Howard heroes.
He embodies the right makes might because he's righteous. He's the righteous wrath, and that's how he defeats his enemies.
Also through discipline. Like one of the main defining aspects of his character is his rejection of all the adornments of civilization, both in, how he dresses and carries himself. And I remember in the story I mentioned earlier where he's sort of helping the lad whose girlfriend gets kidnapped and put on the pirate ship off the shore. Yeah. The kid is observing his swordsmanship and noticing, like, the kid was infatuated with sort of flashy, indulgent kind of swordplay. He had that sort of romantic obsession with it. And while he was observing Kane, he saw that Kane had none of that. It was pure business, but that he was also a master. Yes,
it was Kane's tool. It wasn't an expression of who he was.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
If you had a tournament, if you took all the Robert E. Howard characters and made them fight each other, Kane would get eliminated in the first round. And it's very interesting that I reread all the stories over the past 2 weeks, and I had read, like, Moon of Skulls. I probably read this every 10 years for like 50 years or 40 years. The interesting thing that I detected in this last reading is Kane's not a Puritan. It's put forth in the first 2 stories. He affected a puritanical garb, and he admits to have formerly been one of those sea captains before he realized what they were, and that what he was involved in was, this unjust undertaking. So he's really this penitent character, and actually the Puritan garb is just something he affected.
Yeah, it's an expression, it's self-denial.
Yeah,
and his single-mindedness to exact vengeance and do right and protect the weak.
At the end of the story that we're talking about, it's interesting because it's got all the Kane character elements in it, and it was not sold. The Blue Flame of Vengeance even begins with the quote attributed to Solomon Kane. And this was right square in the middle of Howard trying to keep this character going. This is story 8 and 16 out of 16. This was right in the middle of the series, and you could tell after he failed to sell this, he decided just to write Kane in Africa from now on. Because before this, he went through a period where he tried to write Kane in Europe. He really wanted to put some Solomon Kane in these Lovecraftian settings in these forests, in the Black Forest. He did that with one story that sold, Rattle of Bones. Then he started to write The Castle of the Devil and Death's Black Riders that were also set in the Black Forest. Howard really wanted to have some geographical continuity to his characters, but the way the editors purchased stuff for these magazines, it wasn't going to permit that. So he did 2 horror stories set in a place called Farringtown before he wrote these stories in England, and he only sold the first one. Then he set his first 2 Kane stories near a place called Torkertown in England. So again, he wanted some geographical continuity. He wanted some place for these stories to revolve around, and the editor just wouldn't go for it. And that second story, The Right Hand of Doom, which was also set in this just within miles of the story Skulls and the Stars, which was his first story, that's probably one of his better horror stories, and it's very short, and it kind of predicts a lot of the Howard villains that are evil men that have this supreme psychological power. This guy actually is bragging about how this necromancer is going to die tomorrow. He's going to be hanged at dawn, and he was bragging that he turned him in. And Solomon Kane was in the tavern, and he just told the guy that he was a dastard. He said, "It's a terrible thing you did." He said, "Yes, this man deserves to die for his sins, but you were the only friend he had. He counted you as a friend and named you so, and you betrayed him." And in the middle of the night, he hears something in the room next door where this other guy is, and he sees this guy being killed by this big 5-legged spider. And Kane goes in and he stabs the spider, and the spider is not a spider, it's this hairy human hand. And so the man that was waiting to be hung the next day asked the guard if he'd do him one favor, and the guard said yes. He said, cut off my right hand. So the guard cuts off his right hand, and this guy throws the hand out the window, and the guard swore that all that night the man was sitting there in a trance, say, left, go left some more, climb the wall. And he's giving commands to his hand to go strangle this guy that turned him in. So even with this Kane character that's practicing the severe discipline, he expresses the belief that he thought the personal loyalty should come before everything, which is, that's a sin right there for this type of character. But that was Howard's second look at this guy. He comes out and he says that, how important personal loyalty was for him. So he kind of portrays himself as having formerly been of the Cavalier class.
Well, that's not altogether different as far as his personal code of ethics than, say, Conan, where Conan will be, in various stories, be breaking into some manor or castle in order to steal things. And I remember in one of them, he's being interrogated, and he's basically asked about his word, and he says, I'm not a dog. This is just after he'd been caught trying to steal, but he takes his word very seriously all the same.
This story is Rogues in the House.
Ah, yeah, that one.
And some sissy nobleman ends up hiring out of prison to go kill the sorcerer.
Right.
Right, after he's interrogated. Oh, and actually the one you were talking about was The God in the Bowl, which wasn't sold. Okay. But they both had the same theme. He was being interrogated by Demetrius, the city lawyer, like the prosecuting attorney that comes to the place where he was caught stealing to interrogate him, and he says, I'm not a dog. The story that I brought up, Rogues in the House, he got caught stealing, and then some nobleman promises to bribe the guard to let him out of jail if he'll go kill the sorcerer for him. But in both cases, he would not betray his employer.
Yes.
But when he was hired to do these things.
In the story you mentioned earlier, James, Rattle of Bones, that's the one with the House of the Cleft Skull, right? The short one.
Yes, and he arrives there with another guy that's not entirely trustworthy. And then the guy that runs the place is even worse than the both of them.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the story, the first one that caught my attention for the fact that Solomon Kane is not usually alone compared to other heroes, or particularly compared to Conan, who doesn't need anybody's help. But Solomon Kane has his blood brother Nalanga later in the series. But even here, he was ready to make friends with this guy that he was just encountered at the inn or on the road, although it turns out that wasn't a good idea. But he's more open to either companionship or alliance or things like that.
It might just be from a creative perspective, because Kane on his own is sort of uninteresting, that he's not playing off of someone because his personality is so lifeless, whereas Conan is so full of vitality that he's interesting no matter what he's doing.
Actually, to Nick's point, that comes off in the next story that Howard tried to write but did not finish after Rattle of Bones was The Castle of the Devil. And it begins from the perspective of a roving English mercenary captain named John Silent, who meets up with Kane, and he's really impressed by his dour manner. And Kane's not impressed with him at all because this guy swears and he talks too much. The story had the beginnings of an excellent story, and it was not pursued after the opening scene when John Silent finds to his horror that the castle that they're passing beneath, that's run by this baron has famously ill temper, Kane has taken a boy down off the gallows that he found hanging because he thought he was too young to be executed. And then John Silent said, you can't do that. That was the baron sentence that boy to death, and you can't take somebody down. And Kane said, well, then maybe I'll have to have a talk with this Baron about his behavior. Yeah, so he's ready to go up to this castle and chastise this man that runs the whole area. And the story ends right there with John Silent just trying to comprehend what kind of maniac this guy is as they walk into the castle. So, and then he tried to write Death's Black Riders, which would essentially be like taking The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and putting Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name right in the middle of it. Kind of ruins it as far as the passive horror experience that Americans like so much. So maybe he thought he wouldn't be able to sell it for that reason. My feeling is that since he went right into Moon of the Skulls after that, he just knew he wasn't going to sell anything else until he set it down in Africa again, because he seemed to be very, very responsive to the needs of the editor and would feel the guy out.
I think this was just a few years after they discovered King Tut's tomb, so there was like a worldwide Africa thing going on, so that may be part of it.
Yeah, and that series of stories relentlessly takes him from the West African coast to what would have probably been somewhere around the extreme southern Sudan or the extreme north of the rainforest. So yeah, he was consciously trying to take the character to the Levant via Africa.
I was curious, James, if you could speak a little bit about Howard, because I wanted to get your take on, for instance, his suicide.
You know what? I actually have been excoriated by Howard buffs for looking at Howard through his writing instead of examining his letters to his friends. And so one of the guys even sent me Howard's collected letters. So I have all Howard's collected letters, and I read one of them, and I wrote a brief impression of the letter, and then a guy emailed me. He said, you're not allowed to have those. You can't comment on those. He's like, I could get in a lot of trouble for sending those to you. I'm not even supposed to have them. So I stopped reading Howard's letters right then. So I don't have any. At that point, I decided that this was purely going to be a literary exercise on my point, because the Robert E. Howard geekdom is at such a level that, I mean, I'm convinced these guys probably know, like what kind of toes he had, if he had a hammer toe or if he had one that got broken or something like that. I mean, these guys know everything about him. So
okay, I will say that someone not that long ago left the text of a letter in one of the comments on your site, and it was really interesting. He was writing back and summarizing a lot of his ancestors who had fought in wars and who had been big, strong men. So I think that letter in particular showed his affinity towards this blood memory and pride in your ancestors and things like that. But along those lines, James,
I to answer it, but just not through knowledge of Howard. That's what I was saying.
All right, I just remembered that, so I wanted to.
Well, and to that point, I believe it was H.P. Lovecraft who said that he came to understand Howard's stories far better from his correspondence with him and what he came to know about Howard the Man.
The story that I would look at, so I decided at this point when I found out I wasn't allowed to comment on these letters about Howard, that I would just look at him through his stories and just do it that way. One of the last stories he wrote, and he failed to sell it in two versions. Okay? It's called The Black Stranger. It's one of Howard's best stories. It was written as a Conan story, and he could not sell it. And this was a major effort. This was a long novelette, almost a novella, and this would have been a nice payday for him. So he then went and rewrote it, and it might have been one of the very last things he wrote. And he created an early modern Conan character named Black Volmea. Howard tried endlessly to write and sell pirate stories, and I don't think was successful in selling any of the pirate stories he wrote, even though he'd obviously read deeply in the subject. Black Volmea is like Conan with the gloves off. Okay, so like if you're going to have a tournament of all Howard's characters and they're going to fight each other, this is the asshole that's going to win. Okay, he's a mean, angry Conan. Okay, And he's an Irish guy that absolutely hates the British with a seething passion. And Howard successfully did his best rewrite. There's one story that Howard rewrote 3 times and didn't sell. And the third time he rewrote it, the second and third time he rewrote it was as a Conan story, and he still didn't sell it. And it's The Frost Giant's Daughter, where Conan famously rapes a goddess, okay? A Norse goddess, which is my favorite Robert E. Howard scene. But
is she the one who appears on the battlefields of the dead?
Yes.
She was asking for it.
She wanted it. She wanted it, you know. So we might be able to slide Conan's Supreme Court nomination through. Actually, we could put that story up there. Well, anyhow, and this story was sold as The Treasure of Tranicus, as its own standalone Conan novella written by Robert E. Howard. Was never sold. He wrote it after, I believe he wrote it after Black Canaan and Red Nails. Red Nails is the last story to ever be published. It went into publication when he was already dead. Now, at the end of this story, The Black Stranger, which was just an excellent story, there's 2 girls. There's the niece of a duke who's this insane creep that brought this doom upon his family. And then there's her slave girl, who she's adopted as like her little sister. And it's more than once in this story where the girl considers suicide because she feels like there's just darkness all around her in her life, and there's no way out. Particularly, there's no way out for a woman that's in bad straits in this life. And she was a woman alone. And I think they had believed that the leading man, that the Conan Blackville May character, had died, and there was going to be nobody to save them now. And they were going to join into a suicide pact. You know, the lady was going to kill the girl and then kill herself. And then the hero shows up and he stops this. You know, and he actually gives up his treasure. He's got this whole fortune that he found in the ashes of this Holocaust that happened, where this fort in the wilderness was burned down by these pirates and savages fighting over this treasure. And he just gives it to him. And he says, I can get another one of these. As soon as I get a new crew, I'm going to be, you know, it's going to be rapine and pillage, and I'm going to have a new treasure. So you girls can have this. So that's the most striking thing about his suicide, is that story might have been the very last thing that he wrote in an attempt to sell it. And he did a superb job. Probably his second best story that he ever wrote. His best being The Worms of the Earth. And he couldn't sell this thing to save his life, and it was his most marketable character.
I understand he was writing some Westerns, too. I've never read any of them. Have you, James?
Yes. He wrote a bunch of them. They break into 2 halves. There's 3. There's 3 types of Westerns he did. There were the weird Westerns, including some poems, where there were horrific elements in it. And I'm going to make a prediction when we're done here, what I think his favorite Western movie would have been if he'd have lived to see it, okay, based on the Westerns he wrote. Then there's his hard-boiled Westerns, which he sold a couple of them in different. There was The Last Ride. You can find them in a paperback titled The Last Ride. And there's about 7 of these stories. And one of his characters is a mountain man. It's a Grizzly Elkins, I think. And they're very violent and very ham-fisted. As far as pushing the pace, his pace with his Westerns were as good as any of his stories. And I think challenged the mentality of people who normally read Westerns as far as how pushy they were. He didn't take as much time for the niceties as I think you're supposed to in that genre. And then there's the humorous Westerns, which I've only read one of them, which the Grizzly Elkins character, I think, also figures in them. Saving them for last since they're humorous, and trying to see, by looking at when they were written, where they thread in with the rest of his fiction. So I haven't read more than one of those stories that are in that series, but they're supposed to be lightly humorous Westerns.
Let me take a guess on what you think Howard's favorite Western would have been, Phil.
Okay.
It's biased because it's my favorite Western as well, but The Wild Bunch?
No, but that would actually fit for the subject. High Plains Drifter.
Oh, okay.
because
Okay.
Howard so much wanted to put horrific elements in his westerns, and he ended up compromising with the Kirby Buckner character, who's the closest character to Kane that he writes. He shows up in 2 or 3 stories. He's the hero in Black Canaan, and he's also the third person. He's the cop that shows up at the end of the horror story that actually doesn't get butchered by the monster like they would do in modern horror. Kirby Buckner. He's just a guy that does the right thing. He's not, he's not supremely athletic. He's just a tall, fit, assertive man that believes in right and wrong, and he's got a revolver, and he's willing to use it.
And he's really unafraid. That story has a lot of elements. I think it's Pigeons from Hell, right?
Yeah.
So one of the elements that's introduced right away is the contrast between a couple of Yankees on a road trip vacation who are not armed. Neither carries a weapon, and they just kind of traipse into this old mansion to camp for the night.
One of those guys was supposed to be H.P. Lovecraft, I presume.
Oh, really?
That's my pet idea is that Howard was having fun with Lovecraft and he put him in a car with some other Easterner.
Well, H.P. Lovecraft is the arch Yankee Puritan.
Yeah. So, but then Kirby Buckner comes into the rescue and kind of drags this guy along to solve the mystery. But, Kirby is really courageous. I mean, and it's not bravado. He's just out. We're going to figure out what's going on here, and just walk into the house and figure it out. But it made the Yankees look really bad, I thought. But we talked a little bit before, I can't remember exactly, but in some of your old reviews, I think you've written about Conan as like the hero that brings you along, because he's so physically dominant and strong and everything that you can't really put yourself in his shoes, but
Right.
you can join him on an adventure. So I like that aspect of it. Whereas then Kane is like the daddy. He's protecting all these primitive tribes in Africa from the terrorizing harpies or whatever it is that are after them. Kane is your dad, but Conan's your big brother.
Howard put himself in a couple of his stories. Definitely one, Beyond the Black River, which is basically like Last of the Mohicans as a Conan story. He puts a character named Balthus in here, who even has a dog that he particularly likes, and it's a big savage dog. And he kills that character. This character that, according to the Robert E. Howard historians that I read concerning this story, some of them were of the opinion that this character, Balthus, was supposed to be Robert E. Howard, and that was supposed to be his dog that was in the story. And then, if this is the case, Howard kills himself off at the end of this story, right before it's resolved. He kills himself off in the next to the last act of the story, before Conan saves some of the remaining settlers that hadn't been slaughtered. And there is also, in the story that Nick brought up earlier, the Blue Flame of Vengeance, the hot-headed young swordsman that really actually enjoys fighting and is then later observing Kane, who's very much he's in the narrator's breast pocket here, this character. That, to me, is probably Howard inserting himself in there, too, where he's letting a part of his ego come along with this character for the ride. That story doesn't sell. The story that he sold, that he put himself in, he kills himself in the story. So I don't know what kind of psychological significance that has to do with the terms of his death, but I can tell you that he did kill himself as soon as his mother was pronounced dead. He went out in his car and blew his brains out. In his stories, and this, you usually get the other take, when you see mainstream people look at the Conan stories, you see an extremely sympathetic view of the plight of women in Robert E. Howard stories in general, and specifically in the Conan stories. Okay, you see Conan just as often from a female point of view as you see Conan written from the narrator's point of view. And these women are usually women that have had to make very difficult choices and sometimes have a lot of ability. There's only one of them that's like what you would see in a modern action adventure fantasy where she's actually a sword fighter and stuff in these Conan stories. But the other women, none of them are just baggage. None of them are just slave girls that he tosses over his shoulder. He does some of that. The most bimboific one was this girl named Marilia, who's an actress, but she acts, and she acts for her life. He has her impersonating an ancient goddess or something to try to get this Negro treasure from the savage tribe. So, you know, I think he slaps her on the ass and calls her a slut or something like that, you know. But she's a real character, and she really does things to save herself and to help this dude out. Okay, so Conan actually gets saved by women a couple of times.
Oh, yeah.
In these different stories. So there's a lot of for a woman as a protagonist in Howard, in his writing, and he actually wrote 2 female protagonists, Red Sonja, okay, which has been done horribly in different adaptations in comic and film. And there's another one, Dark Agnes, who's probably my favorite female fantasy character. And Howard's got a huge appreciation of the female as a protagonist, so obviously that ties into him committing suicide as soon as his mother dies.
I think that it has to do with that he didn't want to hurt his mother, you know, and because I think what had happened was that she had always been sickly, and then she finally became very ill, and he asked the doctor, do you think she'll survive? And the doctor told him basically, like, probably not even another day. So he ended up dying sooner than she did, but she didn't ever wake up and learn that he had killed himself. So I saw it as that he had been waiting for his chance, but he didn't want to hurt his mom.
So as soon as he knew that it wasn't going to hurt her, he checked out.
Yeah.
And there are other Robert E. Howard stories where suicide is put forward as a viable way of preserving yourself from the world. You know, a final action where it's not just the world eating you by bits and pieces. And it's done most articulately by the character whose name I can't recall in the last Conan story that he wrote. And he never sold it. And he went through a lot of effort to sell, okay? I have tried to sell stuff before. I wrote 48 articles for martial arts magazines and sold 11 of them. So I know what it's like mentally to be there trying to write to sell. And it's pretty stressful, and it can really get you down. And when you write something that's better than anything you wrote, and it gets rejected, I had that happen to me when I was writing to sell. That's really depressing. I stopped writing for like 4 years. I failed to sell When Your Food to Pound and Press. That's it. I'm not going to write anymore. That was in 2000. I didn't write anything till like 2004, I think.
As I understand it, Howard was more amenable to making revisions for the editorial line than his friend H.P. Lovecraft was. He
recycled a lot of stuff. He had the first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. That was a rewritten call story. That was flat out rejected. And he rewrote it, and then it was rejected again, and he made some revisions, and then he sold that story. The Frost Giant's Daughter, he rewrote it 3 times and never sold it. And this last story, this novella that he wrote and rewrote it twice, it was actually superior to most of what he had written, and he couldn't sell it. And that had to. He must have felt like he was hitting some kind of wall there as far as his writing career goes. And since I didn't read his letters, I have no idea how important his writing career was to him. But from reading him, I'm certain that his writing career was more important to him than it is to me, than my writing career is to me. And it's very important to me. To a large extent, I haven't done some very self-destructive things because of my writing career. Not that I'm somebody that considers suicide, but there's some really nutty things I wanted to do that I didn't do because I wanted to finish my writing projects. I'm sure there's something in there in his suicide that had something to do with him not being able to sell the Black Stranger, even after a rewrite. He even created a whole new character so he could rewrite the story as a non-Conan story. Maybe he was thinking that he had hit the wall with Conan, there weren't going to be more Conan acceptances. I don't know. And the novel, the only novel that he completed, The Hour of the Dragon, that was in many ways a rewrite of the Scarlet Citadel. So he had really a high level of patience. If he thought that there was going to be a sale in it, because this is a guy during the Depression who was actually making a living as a writer, he must have felt pretty good. He had a high level of tolerance for rewriting, just based on the history of writing the Conan character.
So here's a question for you, James. You sent me a bunch of reviews to post. I'll post over the next few weeks on the blog spot. But one of them, you wrote that this would be the fragment that you would be most inclined to complete. Well, what I want to ask you is more like how, if you're hesitant to talk about Howard on a personal level, but as a writer, you must understand him in a way because you do that. You could even picture yourself completing a fragment. It's a different thing from just trying to analyze his biography and his letters and things. But I feel like there's a kinship there because you are a writer.
I have been accused of being a reincarnation of Robert E. Howard. Okay, there was a couple of guys 3 years ago that even did a comparison of our skulls.
Oh, I remember that.
And yeah.
Yeah. So, I remember
that. It was quite interesting. I was very much flattered. When I found out how much Robert E. Howard scholarship there was out there, that I had been ignorant of the fact that there would even be a desire for it. Okay, as a huge fan of his work, then I decided that I was not going to try to join this group of people. There are already more than enough. There's panels of these guys that show up at conventions, and they're all experts on the guy.
They hand out awards to young writers. Yeah.
I did read a biography, Blood and Thunder, by Mark Fenn. It was really good. And I just decided, as far as biographical information on Howard, unless one of my Howard fanatic readers writes in and corrects me, I just use Finn's work because he went to trouble actually producing the whole book as my guide. And I've made no attempt to try to understand him as a person, as a child, as a guy. The only attempt I've tried to do is to try to see him through his writing. Okay, so I've had different phases in my life where I've actually had to go to my old stuff that I wrote and decide what I'm throwing out, what I'm going to rewrite, what kind of writer I'm going to be. And I've actually had to try to look at myself 10 years ago from the point of view of a writer that's a lot better than he was then and decide what I was going to do with it. So I've really just been looking at Howard in that way. And for one thing, he's a genius. He was a genius. This guy did all this writing in his 20s. This is not. I couldn't write anything that was worth a shit until I was like 40 years old. So if I was Robert E. Howard, I wouldn't have written word one. Okay, I would have checked out before I even started writing. So one of the things that I try to keep in mind is that this is a guy that had a gift that I didn't have. I've been able to work at trying to put together stuff that hopefully might be as entertaining as some of the stuff he did, but I'm also a lot older than he is. He seemed to have been much better socialized than I was from reading his biography. He actually had a circle of friends. That's not something I had. I didn't see much of anything in me that lined up with Howard other than hating the world. That seemed to be the one thing that him and I really had in common, hating the way, men had molded the world. So I've just looked at him from the point of view as a writer. That's it. So it's just stuff that I can find in his writing. I'm working on a method of comparing his different characters right now. I pulled 7 characteristics of the characters. I did this formally with the way he constructed stories for his heroes. Now I'm actually looking at the characteristics of the characters, and maybe they'll give me an insight that somebody else didn't get. I don't know. But I've got to tell you that he was obsessed with a guy named Richard Grenville, who committed suicide as a protest against his chance at honor being taken. We're taught that the Battle of the Spanish Armada was this big iffy thing, and wow, if the British would have lost, the Spanish army would have landed. It was such a sure deal that Richard Grenville, who commanded 51 ships and was renowned as the best fighting captain, was made to sit out the entire battle with all of his ships. He sat in a port, I think it was Bristol, he sat in the Irish Sea and the Bristol Channel. He was going to have no chance of distinguishing himself in this battle. He was dishonored in this way because he was Sir Walter Raleigh's right-hand man. He was the guy who actually supervised the Roanoke expeditions. So his honor was being impugned in the worst way, keeping him out of the history book because of his association, because of his loyalty to Sir Walter Raleigh, who would be beheaded soon after, some years after Sir Richard Grenville commits his glorious suicide. He had 3 to 6 ships. I forget what the number was. The Spanish had 53 ships. This was a battle off of the Azores. This is in 2 of Howard's poems about different characters, okay, but Grenville's in it. It's in Solomon Kane's Homecoming, so it has bound up with a lot of what the character meant to him, was Grenville's, the theft of Grenville's honor and heroism by his backstabbing enemies. He went out looking for the Spanish, and he found them. He found 53 ships. He knew that they were going to lose the battle, so he asked his men if they were with him. They said they were with him, so he sent all the ships away except for his flagship. The job of the other ships was to watch the battle and report home, so everybody knew what kind of guy he was. And he fought those 53 Spanish ships for 3 days. The last he was seen, he was being taken captive and hauled away, probably done terribly to death in some Spanish dungeon under the Inquisition, or maybe even sold to Turks. Interesting thing about the Solomon Kane character is that in Howard's telling of it, Grenville was killed. He's not captured, and Solomon Kane is captured. And Solomon Kane is then sold to the Turks, and he rose on a Turkish galley. I've reason to believe a lot of Kane's history as a character is based on Captain Jonathan Smith's history as an explorer. He's the guy that famously met Pocahontas. And what's interesting is Kane never even has a second thought when these beautiful women proposition him in the stories. It only happens twice, but he's not even tempted a little bit. People were critical of Captain John Smith, accusing him of maybe having sex with Pocahontas or some of the other women, because he did describe how 8 of these young Indian women wearing nothing but blue body paint tried to seduce him, and he claims that he kept his hands to himself and didn't go through with it. Interestingly, Captain John Smith was castrated by accident on an expedition down the James River when his powder satchel, which was unfortunately hanging between his legs, exploded while he was sleeping on a boat. So Captain James Smith, whose career is basically the model for Solomon Kane's career, as far as you can tell the backstory, he was physically castrated. And Solomon Kane acts like a guy with zero libido. None. He's wrath. He's like a robot. Captain John Smith and Richard Grenville, they're all tied into the settling of Virginia. That's where Howard's people came from. Howard's people then went into the Appalachians because they weren't part of the people that were favored in the different struggles. And then they spent time in places like Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas as part of the Confederacy. The Confederacy loses. He has family that fought in that war, and then he ends up in Texas, a state that thinks it's a country to begin with, out on the fringe. So I have to think that a lot of the Solomon Kane character has a lot to do with Howard's tension about what America was and where he fit in and where his family fit in.
And what do you think Howard saw in America?
Betrayal. His reading the Call stories is very important if you haven't. And then reading The Scarlet Citadel and The Hour to Dragon and The Phoenix on the Sword, the King Conan stories, where Conan's the king. Conan is a rabid populace. He's this barbarian from an enemy tribe that becomes king of the tribal enemy. And as soon as he becomes king, he's for the working man. Okay? Yeah, he could be a union leader or something. Howard's idea of who the national leader should be was very populist. Ross Perot, before Daddy Bush threatened to kill his daughter, and he kind of put himself out of the presidential race, I think would be a good idea, a good perspective. It's also a Texas perspective on the betrayal of the American people by their nation.
Or maybe Huey Long.
By the government. Yeah. Yeah, so Kane's a really complicated character. The Conan character is so complicated he seems like a simpleton. Kane's conflicted and complex on the face. Before we're done, I want to read one passage, which I'll try not to butcher. I can't. I have a hard time reading out loud in front of class. Okay, it's a real good job doing reading, so I wish you was here to read this, but it's a short. It's like one stanza, so I should be able to not botch it too much. But anyhow, what I want to do before I read this piece, I want to see what it was that Nick was going to ask about, and then I wanted to do a little fun game with you too. It was an article I was going to write today, but I didn't get around to writing because I was dog sitting and the dogs kicked my ass. Okay, I was outwitted by these two pea-brain rat killers. So what we're going to say?
I forgot whatever my question was.
Okay.
I forgot like at least 10 questions.
Okay. So I've demonstrated the hobo power of the ramble. This is what you do when you're afraid you're overmatched in conversation. Is ramble on so they forget their points.
You've done that to me many times, and then I sound like an idiot. That's all right.
Sorry. Well, I'm the idiot, and it just took me too long to. Okay, if I watched it, I was down Megan's house on Monday. And she's like, what do you want to watch? We had Netflix. I said, okay, there's this Solomon Kane movie that I reviewed like 4 years ago, and I absolutely hated it. I need to watch it again because I'm going to do a podcast on this. I couldn't finish watching it. It was so terrible.
Oh.
Nick, this movie, Solomon Kane, okay, is a Catholic.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. It was terrible. I saw it. Yeah, he was a monk. He's like a Catholic monk.
He's sheltering in Catholic monasteries in Elizabethan, England. When like the king of Catholicism wants to rape the queen of the country, right? It was absolutely horrific. I don't know who the actor was. Actually, the actors in the movie were quite good, and I thought he was quite good, but I thought he was poorly cast. I even saw an interview with him talking about how he got into the Solomon Kane character. And this is like a short, semi-athletic, highly charismatic guy that does really good with facial expressions. Now, Solomon Kane is described in two passages by Howard as looking corpse-like. There's a really real case to be made that Solomon Kane is undead. Okay, that he's actually this spectral monster. Okay, and you got this guy that's like a Daniel Craig understudy playing him. So my question was, pick from any decade you want. If you two were, let's say some movie producer said, I heard your podcast and I want to do a Solomon Kane movie. Okay. Give me an actor that you would cast as Solomon Kane. And if it's an old time actor, that's fine. I'll find somebody new that kind of fits that mold. So who would you pick for an actor to play Solomon Kane if you were casting for a movie?
Oh, man. Lynn, you want to go first? I got to think about this for a second.
I'll go first because James warned me. Well, it has to be an English guy. This is what I thought. It has to be an English guy. Okay. So I thought naturally Idris Elba. Okay.
Well, wait. Now, there's a lot of reasons why he should play James Bond. Okay.
No,
there's a whole lot of reasons why he should
really
play James Bond.
I'm really proud because I came up with a joke.
Okay. Is that the guy that played the mercenary leader in Beasts of No Nation about the African boy soldiers?
I don't know.
Yes.
He put Stringer Bell in The Wire?
Yes.
Okay, excellent actor.
He's English, right?
Okay. But that was funny, Lynn. That was really funny. I would cast him as James Bond. If I was making a James Bond movie, he would be James Bond. Okay?
Okay, but I came up with a real guess of a current existing actor. I'm very bad at this game because I don't watch movies ever at all. But I thought maybe Michael Fassbender. Does that make sense? Because he's kind of skinny, right? Is he tall and skinny? I don't know.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but you have to have kind of a angular face. I picture like a cross between the Quaker Oats guys and Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Is what I was trying to picture.
All right.
So I'm sorry. I'm not good at this game.
I might have to go with he's not English, but I wouldn't be choosing this guy out of necessarily if he looks the part, but I might have to go with Matthew McConaughey. I think he's very good at playing characters who are detached from the world.
And he's got an angular face.
Yes, he does.
He's got the angular face. Okay. Yeah, that's very good. I couldn't. I was having the only current actor I could place in the role would be Viggo Mortensen, based on Eastern Promises, where he plays.
Ooh, no, that's a much better choice.
Yeah.
Viggo Mortensen is also apparently actually a very competent swordsman.
Ooh.
Oh, he's definitely an athletic guy.
When he was preparing for the Lord of the Rings films, he was studying under one of the few remaining Western sword masters, and he said the guy apparently said that Viggo is one of the best he'd ever seen.
Oh, good. Okay, well, he would. As far as living actors, I'd have to say, or actors that are still a viable age, I think that's the guy I came up with. But Matthew McConaughey is actually, he's a guy that could probably pull it off. I mean, he did such a good job in Reign of Fire, being a Tennessee psychopath hunting a dragon, that I didn't even know it was him.
Yeah, that was quite the role.
Yeah. I mean, now, as far as historical actors go, Viggo Mortensen was my third pick because I didn't limit it to just guys that are currently acting. Okay. My second pick was the guy that essentially played Solomon Kane in High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood. Now, the problem is his lack of the stentorian voice. Clint Eastwood doesn't have a big voice, and this is something that the Kane character really needs to be complete. But he's tall and he's angular and he's real good at playing this like anonymous, vengeful murderer. But I think the best historical actor to play Solomon Kane, particularly the voice and from the neck up, and because he played a character that was very much a Kane character when he played Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, would be Gregory Peck. Ooh. So if I had to look at historical actors overall, I'd say Gregory Peck would be one, then Clint Eastwood, then Viggo Mortensen would be like the three that I'd pick. Because you have to have a tall, angular guy. But as far as how his voice is described and everything, Gregory Peck, as he spoke in To Kill a Mockingbird, but doing the kind of shit he would do in Moby Dick, would be like a great Solomon Kane character. But doing it to people instead of a whale.
Clive Owen is another one, I think, who could do it.
Clive Owen, what did he play, man?
I based that almost entirely off of this one film he did in particular, I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, which I highly recommend.
Okay, well, I'm going to look. I'm writing that down right now.
Yeah, he plays a retired gangster who something happens to his brother, and he has to come back.
Well, that's going on the viewing list. I'll be watching that in the dressing room at the Sopranos Strip Club in New Jersey next week, I believe. Okay. And I actually, I don't know if you can see like the video feed on this end, Nick, but I'm reading this book, the Solomon Kane book.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah, okay. I have that book.
And I got this book, like 12 years ago. And I used to subscribe to Playboy magazine, and I would tear the cards for to send in and redo your subscription. I used to tear those cards in half and use them as bookmarks. And I found two of them. I found these in this Solomon Kane book while I was reading it. I was like, wow, he'd be disappointed in me. Yeah, he would definitely. He would have no time for conversation with James LaFond. I can tell you that. Okay. This is the next to the last stanza in Solomon Kane's Homecoming. Down the wind like a running pack, the hounds of the ocean bayed, and Solomon Kane rose up again and girt his Spanish blade. in his strange cold eyes a vagrant gleam, grew wayward and blind and bright, and Solomon put the people by and went into the night. That's after he was asked about something in his career in this poem, and then you have that scene, and then the rest of it is just him disappearing into the night. Based on another poem that was unpublished by Howard on the character, The One Black Stain, which was about Solomon Kane disapproving of Drake having somebody executed at St. Julian's Bay, which is near where Magellan had some of his mutineers executed also. He was disappointed that Drake didn't do it with his own hand, that he actually called down the impersonal rule of law when Drake should have actually taken care of this himself. I finally came to the conclusion that I think Kane's like a specter, that Kane's actually an undead character in this, that he's a monster righting wrongs. But
yeah, and in some ways, would you say that it's not entirely wrong to look at these two characters as existing in the same world? I mean, it's once civilization had finally triumphed over Hyperborea, you have Kane as sort of the specter of justice to cleanse the world.
You know what? That's a great point. Because the Conan character was a saleable version of the Call character. Okay, the Call character, he's not just getting away and having a good time and kicking ass. He's worrying about things. He's really pondering the world. So if you want to look at the inspiration for the Conan character, it's really in Call and this ancient usurper. If one of Howard's characters could be Call as an old man, it would be Kane. Yeah, with thinned out, less physical, but still tall and imposing version. That makes a whole lot of sense. And those two characters were actually written at the same time. Kane was started right when Howard was giving up on Call, and Lovecraft was hoping that Howard would not give up on the Call character because the settings were so cool. The settings you could see where they would really appeal to Lovecraft. It was a lot more mystical than the Conan settings, which were more historical. There is one Call story where Call actually leads his army into hell. Just like, it's like, this leads to hell. And he's like, no better place. Let's go. If you could look at a lot of the Conan characteristics as interloping marketing characteristics for a really doable Aryan hero, then you can kind of see Call as his prototype and Kane as a specter of that.
Should we do this again for Call and Kane?
I would, and there's also a couple other characters that are linked to that. That was that whole barbarian usurper character.
Yeah.
There's two other characters that are also bound up in that. So that was the whole complex with Howard. How do you rectify the obvious decency of a barbarian society with the filth of civilization? How can these things coexist?
This is why earlier the film The Wild Bunch came to my mind, because I feel like Peckinpah is a director who I think shares a lot in common with Howard. It's sort of the best part of America in that self-awareness of the barbarian elements, because in his stories, films rather, if you look at The Wild Bunch or Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, or particularly Straw Dogs, you see a lot of the same themes. You see sort of the honor of the barbarian in conflict with the hypocritical facade of civilized society.
I just actually saw The Wild Bunch for the first time.
I haven't seen it.
3 or 4 weeks ago. Yeah, and it's exactly what you're describing. It's not going to be hard to keep track of how many cast members are left at the end there, Lynn. So
yeah, right.
It's not going to challenge your math.
Okay. I just don't watch movies. I am unable to do it for a variety of reasons. But I want to do this again if you guys are both into it. And we could talk about Conan and the sort of characters that work in that vein. But maybe also down the line, we could do the lighthearted characters, because I read all the Steve Costigan stories, and they're really fun and light, and it might be fun to talk about those too.
Absolutely, Lynn. I'd love to do a a deep dive on very specific Conan stories too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, this is really a huge well. That's why I named the series "A Well of Heroes." My attempt to review all of Howard's stuff. There's just so much material in there. I guess I'll leave it to you two young people to plan it, and as soon as I get the plan and the email, I'll put together some more articles and send them to you, and hopefully in a more timely fashion. Okay, well, Solomon Kane's done. I reviewed every Solomon Kane story and fragment and poem at least once now. So as far as my look at the character, this pretty much wraps it up.
And that's good because you're trying to go through everybody, right?
I'm almost done calling Bran McMorn. I'll tell you what, the best Robert E. Howard story is a Bran McMorn story. This is his racial identity character right here, Bran McMorn. That's its own whole thing that you would, I think you would want to do. Okay, Robert E. Howard and race, and use the Bran McMorn character. If I know Nick's had to have read Worms of the Earth, but Lynn, if you haven't read it, read it and see what you think, and then decide when you'd like to do a podcast on that, because that's like one of the best horror stories that I ever read.
Well, we'll do it.
I appreciate you helping out with this, Nick.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm happy to come back.
Before I go, I want to tell listeners that they can find more of James's impressions of Robert E. Howard's writings in the 2 published volumes, A Well of Heroes, Volume 1, and A Well of Heroes, Volume 2. So I'll link those in the show notes. Thanks for listening, everybody. Okay, well, that was episode 47 of the Crackpot Podcast. LaFond, Lockhart, and special guest Nick Mason. Thanks, guys.
Race for the morning, you can hide. know it's clear.